はい、皆様、こんにちは。リンク J のライブウェビナーにご参加をいただきまして、誠にありがとうございます。今日はですね、日英ライフサイエンスセミナーのボリューム4、わかりにくい英国欧州における、規制臨床試験プロセス、を理解しようをお送りさせていただきます。私はですね、リンク J の常務理事をやっております、曽山と申します。今日はですね、MC ロール、の役割をやらせていただきますので、よろしくお願いいたします。今日はですね、画面でお示しをしているようなプログラム、こちらに沿ってですね、進めてまいります。皆様からのご質問、はですね、ウェビナーの Q&A 機能、こちらで受け付けておりますのでですね、どしどし、ご質問をですね、書いていただければ幸いです。パネルディスカッションの時間に、可能な限りお答えしていきたいというふうに思っております。議論の盛り上がりとかですね、あと質問、の数等に応じてですね、終了が10分ぐらい延長する可能性がございますので、よろしくお願いいたします。またですね、事務局の方から2つお願いがあります。ウェビナー終了後にですね、アンケートフォーム表示されますので、ぜひですね、今日のイベントのご感想、今後こんなのやってほしいみたいなね、ご要望等をですね、お寄せいただければ幸いでございます。また先ほど出ておりました2つ目ですが、ウェビナー中の録音、録画、画面キャプチャーなどはお控えをいただきたくよろしくお願いします。あとですね、このイベント、英語で、やりますので、英語の字幕サービスがついております。字幕はですね、市販の、サービスを使っておりますので、その内容に関してはですね、リンク J、オクセンティア、バイオスパイア、ご訳、訳文、欠落とあるかもしれません。そちらに関してはちょっと責任は負いかねますということでよろしくお願いいたします。このシリーズね、実はもう10回以上多分やってると思います。英国をはじめとする欧州のライフサイエンスの、状況、取り組みなんかを取り上げてですね、で、毎回ですね、オクセンティアのシニアコンサルタントであり、リンク J サポーターをずっとやっていただいている、松永、正史さん、にですね、モデレーターをお願いをしております。オクセンティアはですね、最近、またコロナも落ち着いたということで、日本オフィスも開設してくださってですね、より、日本と英国をはじめとする欧州、のブリッジをですね、ライフサイエンス領域において、どんどん、強めていこうというふうになさっています。いろいろと本当にありがとうございます。じゃあ、松永さん、よろしくお願いします。
すみません、ソロンさん、ご紹介を読んでいただきまして、リンク J サポーター、自称アンバサダーの松永と申します。よろしくお願いします。ソロンさんおっしゃった通り、コロナの時にプレゼンスを高めたいということで、いろいろウェビナーをさせてもらいました。最初は、オックスフォードイブニングというタイトルで、いろいろやってきました。で、今考えてエコシステムとか、UK のソフトランディングとか、スタートアップをどうサポートしているのとか、それから日本初のいいスタートアップ企業さんがそこでランディングした経緯があったので、そこを紹介したとか、あと知財のマネージメントとか、テックトランスファー、そんなことを紹介してきました。で、オックスフォードイブニングというタイトルだったんですけれども、もうなんか足りなくなっちゃって、その後日英ライフサイエンスセミナーっていうことで、これも、4、5回、やらせてもらっていて、例えばもうちょっとトピックに沿った形で、AI ドラッグディスカバリーとか、セルセラマとかですね、オルガノイドみたいなところを、やらせていただきました。で、いろいろそのアンケートをその後お聞きする機会があったんですけれども、ちょっと今度その、規制とか、臨床試験、そのあたりのところを、深掘りしてくれないかというリクエストをいただきました。で、確かにそうなんですね。UK がブレックゼットしたり、あと、今日もいろいろキーワードが出てきて、UKCA とか、MHRA とか、NHR とか、NHS とか、いろいろ出てきて、私もよくわからないんですね。で、ちょうどいい作成なんですけれども、素晴らしいスピーカーをご用意いたしました。で、彼女はですね、私がすごい信頼できて、もう5年ぐらい、仕事をさせていただいている、ニコラ、I said, yes. So
Yes.
can you unmute? So now I will introduce yourself. And this is Dr. Nicola, and she's CEO of the company called specialist company called For Theory. And I've been doing business for 4 or 5 years already. And I can say she's very reliable and friendly. And she got very nice colleagues who I can also trust as well. And if you, many people imagine like clinical study is more like a rigid, boring people, but they are very friendly. So maybe I will leave Nicola for, you have like a 20-30 minutes presentation to explain how to enter the UK European market if you want to start the clinical study or regulation stuff. So can I hand over to you? Nicola-san?
Yes, you can. Konnichiwa. Thank you very much, Masashi, and to the lovely colleagues at LinkJ for giving me this opportunity to speak this evening to you all. And I am Nicola Wall, and it's really a pleasure to be here to be able to talk about something that I care a great deal about, which is about running clinical trials, and to hopefully be able to give you some good information today about that process when it comes to the UK and to the EU, but to also be able to talk about a few things that are critical to that process, no matter where you're running a clinical trial. So this is what I'm hoping to cover with you this afternoon. And also, I know that Masashi-san and our LinkJ colleagues have some time for questions afterwards, and I think will be a very good discussion as well. But really to give you some good information, it is a short space of time to potentially provide a lot of information, but I will do my best. So just very quickly to give you a little bit of background about me and about why I'm speaking to you today is that not only do I care a great deal about this industry, but I've spent the vast majority of my career in this industry, which again, I have learned so much on that journey, and which is partly why I want to be able to share that with companies who are also, developing a whole range of products in this life sciences area. So I have had the privilege of being able to work on a lot of different products in my career. So it's enabled me to gain a great deal of knowledge working with some of the most wonderful scientists it's ever been my pleasure to work with, and to learn from those people along that journey, and to be able to share that wisdom and knowledge is very, very important to me. I have actually also had the privilege of working in clinical research and overseeing clinical research in a really large number of countries, which has enabled me also to learn a great deal about the nuances and what it takes to be able to run clinical trials in these countries, which again, I'll be able to speak to you today about that as it relates to the UK and to countries in the European Union in particularly. But I've also worked a great deal in North America and in South America as well. But I think, Masashi-san, we can always talk about that as well during the question session. But the other important point is that I've also been able to work in a number of different therapeutic areas. So a wide range of products. I've been responsible for the trials in a number of these products and a number of these product areas. And again, the learning and the experience that I want to be able to share with you today is very much based on a breadth of experience, shall we say. And I've also been very privileged to work with not just some of the biggest firms in life sciences, but also a lot of the smallest firms, particularly since founding A Fortiori. We've been able to work with so many different small companies. And again, some of the learning that I want to share today is based on that, and is based on companies that are at the cutting edge of developing fantastic new technology. And like I said, I hope to be able to share some of that knowledge today and, get some lessons learned for everyone listening. So let me just get rid of this. so that you can see my screen. So, in terms of the UK, what I wanted to be able to remind everybody about, because I do think that there is a great respect for the UK as a clinical research environment. But what I wanted to share with you today is that very recently there is a real spotlight on how to improve the UK and make it even better from the government's perspective. So they are putting a really big focus on how they can support all of the infrastructure in terms of running clinical research in the UK. So I think that's very important for people to realize that there is some very strong government support. And again, I've put some links in here because I know the slides will be shared, but I wanted to point out that the plans are ambitious. The UK has always been a strong research environment, but there are plans to really support that in the next 2 years, and then obviously again over the next 4 years altogether, about how to really ensure that UK population gets access to clinical research. And I think that's really important to know that in terms of that effort in the UK. I think really importantly, and again, I will come back to this, is that the UK regulatory environment, which includes everything related to the conduct of studies, both for medicines, all kinds of therapies, medical devices, and digital health products. There's a great program that's been in place in the UK for a long time that really streamlines this process. So, as it says here, there is a single application route and coordinated review. So what that means is that in the UK, you submit through this integrated research application system, which again has been put in place. It works really, really well. And the whole point is that it streamlines the process. So as it says here, there will be reviews within 30 days, and the commitment from the regulators in the UK is that then within 60 days, you will have an answer generally in terms of being able to run your clinical study, which is great. And what's important to remember here is that as you go through that process in terms of your clinical trial application, you will essentially gather all of your documentation. It gets put through this electronic system. And then what happens is it's very dynamic, and then you will have to answer a series of questions. But again, the point here is that this process exists in the UK, and I think is a very, very research-friendly process. And again, some helpful links in there in terms of fees and things which are readily available, and that again, everyone can see. So just, again, a very quick overview, but the research capabilities in the UK from what we call the trust. So a trust is just it's just a term that we use in the UK for a hospital or group of hospitals. And as I think everyone knows, there are some of the world's leading universities that then are affiliated with these trusts in the UK. And I think it is only fair to say that, as it says here, the UK is blessed with a rich, diverse and creative academic centre, which in turn greatly supports the research sector in the UK. And lastly, in terms of the UK clinical trial landscape, what I just wanted to point out here is that there are some really great, strong resources available. So the NIHR in the UK is essentially a body that offers all kinds of supports. And again, there are so many resources available online, and again, I'm absolutely happy to be able to send more information after this. But AHSN is academic health support networks. Local experts, of course, we'll talk a little bit more about MHRA scientific advice and what it means now to be able to run decentralized studies. But the point here is that there are tremendous resources available for companies like yourselves that are, hoping or thinking about running clinical trials in the UK. So with that being said, and let me close this. So that's the UK, and I wanted to just point out that why I wanted to put a bit of a spotlight on the UK is that I think since Brexit, there has potentially been some misconceptions about research in the UK and how difficult it might be. And the answer is that it's simply not, and that UK still remains an extremely amazing place to run research. Now, of course, when we take the rest of the EU, because technically, the UK is no longer part of the EU, but what I equally, because, we work across the UK and the EU, I also wanted to be able to let you know again about some of the important considerations about clinical trials and initiating clinical trials in the EU. Is that staggeringly, it's hard to believe, but there are, over 446 million people across those countries, and those countries represent an amazing, diverse population, which, when it comes to designing and running clinical trials, I think, as everyone knows, is an incredibly important consideration. What has also recently changed in the EU, and again, in terms of running clinical research, this is a really important and a really great change, is the Clinical Trials Information System. So as it says here, supports the flow of information between clinical trial sponsors, the European Union member states, and those countries. So essentially, what this is that this is an application system. Now, I just want to point out that at the moment, this only applies to investigational products. It does not apply to devices right now. But for everyone in developing therapeutics of all different kinds, I think it's really important to remember that this system now, again, we talk about streamlining research. So this has been a very welcome process, shall we say, in order to streamline research across the European Union and to streamline that application process. And of course, lastly, but not least, again, to remember that the EU as again, an incredibly amazing, rich, diverse place to run research, but it does actually contain some of the most important research centers in the entire world. And I just put it again, there's a link here, which is very interesting to see some of those research centers and why that they're so important. But what I wanted to point out here, and I will talk about this again, is that actually the number of research centers available across the world is staggering, and they don't all have to be the leading research centers. So I do want to make a point again, and I'll explain why in some of the later slides, that there are lots of great places to run research and to initiate research in the UK and the EU. And even if you don't run your research or you can't place your study at some of these leading hospitals, the fact is that you can still run great clinical trials in lots of other hospitals. Oh, excuse me. So just a very quick word about medical devices, because again, there has been a lot of questions, and I won't read these because I know that you will get access to these slides afterwards. But I do want to point out a couple of different things here, is that there are very specific considerations when it now comes to registering your medical device in the UK. And overall, you will need what's called a UK CA mark now. So of course, we did have the CE mark, whereas now for the UK, you will be expected to obtain a CA mark. And I think the most important thing to remember here is a couple of things: that you need to work with local regulatory experts and market access experts that can help you to really understand what you need for your product, because as everyone knows, in medical devices, it depends on your classification. So again, some fantastic experts out there. There are a number of different things to consider. There's also, the path of self-declaration, and obviously, again, notified bodies in the UK cannot issue a C certificate necessarily. But again, this all depends on what you want to do with your product. But that was just some additional information that I wanted to put into the slides when it comes to devices, because there are some differences that people need to be aware of. So that being said, I want to be able to move on and talk about something that I think is incredibly important when we talk about clinical trials overall. Regardless of where you conduct your study, one of the things that we consistently see that will impact the success of your study is how you've actually planned the entire commercial development of your product. And so this is just a quick overview of these key areas that we think everyone really needs to be aware of, and you need to be aware of them because they impact the success of your clinical trial. And so what we mean by protect, improve, and pay is that when you're developing a commercialization strategy for your product, it is critical that in order to translate that into the right clinical study for your product, you need to really be very, very sure about what your intellectual property strategy is and about the territories and how you expect to protect that product. But most importantly, the claims that you're making as part of your intellectual property strategy will directly affect the type of clinical trial that you want to run. The second, which is to prove your product, is very much about getting the right regulatory strategy in place in order to be able to, again, shape the right clinical trial for your product. So in order to be able to prove that it works, you've got to prove that to the regulators in the jurisdiction where you're running that trial, which, by the way, will impact, because not all jurisdictions want the same type of data. So when it comes to the plan overall, it's really important to think about that and, again, understand what it is that you're doing and why. And then the third part of the strategy overall is about paying for the product. So ultimately, you need to be designing the right type of studies so that you can get the evidence that you need, so that you can sell your product, and that, of course, that you will get reimbursed for. And the reason why we talk about this is that all of those factors are they're so important. And we see this a lot with companies that are very new to the clinical research landscape, shall we say, in life sciences. And I think regardless of where you're running the study, it is absolutely critical to be able to think about this in as far in advance as you can. And so I suppose if I was to have to pull out 5 things, which is what I wanted to do here, was to really understand that whatever you're doing, whatever plan you put in place, we call this the stress test. And what that really means is that when you are planning your clinical trial overall, you can understand that there are so many different types of opinions and expertise that you want to be able to bring into that process. And we call this the 360 approach, is to make sure that in order to plan that study as best as you can, you get as many different views from all of these different expertise domains. And one of the ways to do that is with a trial design committee, because, again, as I've said here, the variety of input and expertise is really, really important. And accessing the right expertise is incredibly important. Now, as I've pointed out in the earlier slides, there's all kinds of expertise available through different resources, particularly in the UK, but also in lots of other different countries. And another way to access that type of expertise is through scientific advice, which you can also get in the UK and also through the EMA as well. But I think it's really important when it comes to clinical trials in various countries that understanding that varieties in standard of care will impact the type of study that you do. So wherever you decide to run your study, particularly in the EU, before you can do anything, you need to understand how that particular treatment or how that standard of care is in that country. Statistical power, I won't talk too much about that because I think hopefully that's obvious that this is very important to understand that, again, this will impact the number of sites and the number of countries, all of those things, depending on how many patients you need. But when you're designing your study, you desperately need to understand that calculating that correctly is very, very important. I think it's only fair to point out that real world evidence, RWE and control arms, in terms of, again, designing a study and thinking about really and truly how many patients you need real time. It's a very important design consideration that everyone needs to be thinking about, again, regardless of that study. And lastly, but not least, you will need various licenses to different things as well. So to really understand that is absolutely critical. So I think I've touched on these. Again, part of the slides is just to really help have some great information for you to look at afterwards. So I've talked a bit about some of these, but what I'd like to do is just carry on and talk a little bit more about what's involved in initiating the study. But I think, again, none of this information that is here will be, I think, new to anybody, but again, just to point out that there are certain things, again, as I said, designing the right study, in my opinion, is the single most important thing you can do to make your study a success overall. And when you really think and put the time and the effort and the expertise into that, it's an incredibly important step in getting everything right when it comes to initiating your trial, wherever that may be. So I suppose one of the ways to think about all of this is that everything that you're doing is all about how you're de-risking your trial, how you're de-risking the trial for your company from a commercial point of view, but of course, de-risking the trial from your participant point of view. And this is, again, a graphic to show that actually, from the clinical trial and the clinical research perspective, in order to initiate that study correctly, you absolutely need to think about these key domain areas here. So when it comes to planning that study, and when you've designed it, the next, obviously, things you need to start thinking about are about your manufacturing and about how you're going to get your product. So when it comes to thinking about where you're going to locate that study, whether, whatever country that's in, you have to think about all of those logistics and all of those things. And again, different countries will have different requirements, and it's really, really important to understand those local nuances. But ultimately, actually, that applies to everything here, particularly the market-driven reasons as to why you might want to locate a study in a particular country are very, very, very important. As I mentioned before, the other part of that is around your intellectual property considerations about, again, what kind of territories you ultimately might want to locate or to sell that product in. And again, the reason why I'm talking about all of this is because these are it's a way of thinking about all of the incredibly important things that it takes to impact success of designing and initiating any kind of clinical trial. So this is a slide that we just like to use to remind everyone of not just the complexity that's involved in initiating a study wherever you initiate it, but to remind people that it's a long and complicated process, which is why I keep talking about the importance of planning and the importance of how you can look at different things in order to be able to de-risk those studies. But one of the other incredibly important things that I wanted to leave you with today is about, what the kinds of things to consider in terms of initiating a study in any country. And again, this has been learned from experience, actually, that your choice of country is something that should be driven by a number of different things. And what we have seen, unfortunately, is that lots and lots of companies tend to make decisions about their studies based on one particular key opinion leader or one particular institution. And really what we have learned is that your decision about where to run your study and the potential success of that study depends on so many other important things that you absolutely have to think about. And so again, as I've said here, the location of a site in any country is a critical decision. It's not just about your primary investigator, your PI, or your key opinion leader. There are lots of great academics, lots of great medical experts available in, as I said, so many different hospitals all across, not just the EU and the UK, but across the world. So we really encourage people to remember that. And also, it really is understanding that even if a KOL says that they can run your study, you need to remember that that's not just about that KOL running your study, that running and initiating any kind of research in a clinical environment, there are so many other considerations. You have to understand that there are budgets, that institution might not be able to run that study because of competing studies. That institution might not be able to run your study because they don't have the resources to run the study. And also, again, the patients may not actually be available, despite what your experts might say. So what I want to be able to do here is just remind everybody how important it is that thinking about where to locate your research is so much more than about where you may want to locate it because of a KOL. And I say that from really, really important experience. So there was a lot here to get through, and I hope that it's been useful and that there are also, some key things maybe that you want to understand and learn more about. And again, I just want to point out there are so many fantastic experts out there that can help in addition to, ourselves here today, but I know that LinkJ has tremendous resources available. Just a quick reminder here about planning. So legal representation, one of the first things you're going to have to think about. And again, it's absolutely quite a straightforward thing to do. But when you are running studies in other countries, that's one of the things you will have to think about. Being extremely clear in and understanding what documentation to have before you even start conversations with people, which is why we talk about correct product characterization and understanding that, because when you have that, then it provides great information for people and to make sure that you're going to get the right expertise to help you. Timelines for submissions and costs, again, a lot of those are available on various websites in terms of, like for the UK, for example, the MHRA is very clear on that. And I'm happy to take some questions on that. And again, the commercialization plan, please have a clinical development plan. It's one of the most important things that you can have. and also know who you need to provide that expertise to be able to support you on this journey. Who can help you? There's lots of great people out there that can help. And I think I've pretty much said all of these things. Planning, access the right experts, really understand about this whole view that when you're designing and initiating any kind of study, that there are lots of different perspectives that you need to take into account, and not just the clinical perspective. The stress testing, again, be open to having different opinions on running that study and how that study might run correctly for you. And when you choose your country, again, get advice on all of the different things that might impact the success of your research in that study. I like to say that I'm in the evidence business, and represent a whole group of fantastic people that we are what we say clinical trialists. So we're here to help you obtain usable, high quality data, which demonstrates efficacy and safety and is acceptable to regulators and payers. But all of those things are really only possible because of great innovating companies like yourselves. And I just want to say, Arigato, thank you for having me. And I'm ready to take some questions, Masashi-san.
Great, thank you, Nicola, for your fantastic talk. Thanks for keeping your speak slowly. It's more understandable for the audiences. All right, so I keep watching the number of attendees. It's quite amazing. Like keep over 300 audiences, so it's quite big attention for this session. And I will welcome Shunichi-san, Takahashi-san from LinkJ. He's a CEO of LinkJ, and he's an expert. He studied more than 20 years in pharmaceutical companies, so he's better than me for the panelists. So we're gonna start Q&A, and please, I have 4 questions on the chat box already. I tried to cover as possible in the last 30 minutes or so. And how shall we start? Maybe Shunichi-san, do you have questions we can crack on?
Okay. Hi, Nicola. Thank you for your presentation and the regulatory process of clinical trial in UK and EU. I think it was very interesting. And, today we have more than 300, audience, as Masashi-san mentioned. And the state audience may include the wide range of people from, venture companies to large scale, corporations. So that's why I'd like to ask some few questions from the Japanese perspective. So the first question is, have you seen an increase of the number of clinical trials conducted by Japanese companies, or have you seen an increase in inquiries from Japanese companies to your company regarding the clinical trial in EU?
Only very, very small, and I think part of the issue again is that there seems to be, I think, maybe not a misunderstanding, but certainly a concern ever since Brexit has taken place, that because the UK has taken itself away from the EU, that it's probably not a good idea to run trials there. And I think that's just a perception, and I can only speak from, from what we've seen. But I actually think that that's changing more recently. And I think as well, Shunichi-san, that obviously the difficulties in the last 3 years with COVID had just obviously impacted the number of inquiries anyway. So I think, but this year, certainly 2023, we've seen a slight increase. We're really hoping that, after sessions like today, for example, and, hopefully that I've been able to say how great the UK is for running research and continues to be for running research, that we will see a bigger increase. But I can't honestly say that there really has been up until now. But I do have great hopes and expectations that it will increase further now.
Okay. And also, in your presentation, you mentioned that the UK government is aiming to double the number of participants in clinical trial over the next 2 years, and furthermore by 2026 or 7. So what specific measures are being discussed? And, what kind of tangible action will be implemented? What do you think?
It's a great question. And actually, I'm going to make sure there's a link to that report, because it's a report by the Lord O'Shaughnessy that was published last month, actually. And there's 27 different recommendations that are going to be put in place. So that's a lot, right? And of course, I think, as everybody probably understands, one of the most important ones is about funding to hospitals, funding to academic institutions so that they can have better trained staff that are able to help conduct research, and also funding into patient involvement, because I think, again, that's something that the UK has been a great advocate for. And I think, as everyone who's planning and conducting clinical trials knows and understands, that recruitment still continues to be one of the biggest barriers to successful trials. And I'm sure you know that from your experience as well. So part of those recommendations and part of what the UK government is going to fund is different types of plans to really help patient engagement in research, and to really help people understand from the patient perspective what it means to be involved in research, and to encourage them to be involved in research. But I will make sure the link, I thought I'd put it in there, but I didn't, Masashi, but I'll make sure the link to that report is available, and I can send you the updated slides with the link in it, because there are 27 recommendations, like I said. That's I think that shows a great willingness.
Yes, lots of support. So do you think, these support available to the overseas companies as well?
Yes, because, and in fact, I know, and Masashi knows this as well, that, some companies have accessed expertise and support through the NIHR and also through the AHSN, which is, again, these are all acronyms, but if you just pop them into Google, it brings you straight to these websites. So there are absolutely supports. There's something called the portfolio system as well in the UK, which, if a company qualifies for that, it can automatically mean all kinds of support in terms of figuring out where you might want to run your clinical trials. So I think the most important thing is to find the right experts as well to be able to help, and to be able to signpost effectively. I think it's really important, because depending on exactly what your product is will also make a difference in that.
Okay, Masashi, I stop here once, and maybe you have some questions.
Yes, all right. So yes, thanks, Nicola. So you kept talking like planning is the most important stuff. And so the main notice is from today is the big now trend UK European market. And I know you offer support for what we call like a workshop. This will be linked to what you mentioned, the 360 approach. So you will combine everything like IP, clinical trial, clinical expert, etc., including the gap analysis. Can you explain more for your support to prepare like a routine or passport to enter to the studies?
Yeah, because even looking at a lot of the questions that we have here, Masashi, it's really, really difficult to give people answers to these types of questions because they're so in-depth. So that's why we created a very reasonably priced program, which is we called a workshop. And the reason why was because companies came to us with inquiries, and they are questions that they are not easy answers to, and that they involve bringing in experts. But you'd be surprised how many things you can cover when you have a company's attention and everyone is sitting around the table, whether that's virtually or not. And you can work through a series of questions and people are able to understand, because then what we do is we have the experts there to answer those questions. And then depending on what the answers to those questions are, it might bring up other questions immediately, which can also be answered. So it's a very dynamic process. And when you have people around the table that have that expertise and that knowledge, you're not waiting around to get those answers. You can get pretty much a really good sense of where you need to go. Now, there's only so much detail that you can go into, but when you come together with a really good structured agenda, a set of objectives about what you need to plan and understand. And when I talk about the 360 approach, so for example, our agenda for a workshop like that would be understanding what your IP strategy is and what your timelines are. Because I think, as everybody knows, different things in your patent, different types of data that you need it's really important that the timing for that's understood as to when you might get data from any kind of clinical study. And if you don't plan an interim analysis into a clinical study, then you won't necessarily be able to provide data that the patent folks might need. So the workshop's not just about questions and answers, it's also about being able to start to put together a hypothetical timeline, which is essentially a roadmap at a high level, but that it's still useful enough to provide good information about timing, about different things to consider when it comes to location. I noticed here that actually it's interesting. People always ask these questions about where I should be running my study if I want to do this, that, and the other. And these are the kind of things that can be really talked through in an environment where you have the right people to answer those questions, because simple answer is, it depends. And the simple answer is that there's no simple answer. And I think that's really important for people to understand, that all of these considerations are very nuanced and that it's never just about one thing. I think that's why we have created some of the graphics we created, and we try to keep it simple with the protect, prove, and pay. But understanding your clinical research and what you need to do with your trial is very much driven by what you want to do in your market, what that market is, as well as your IP and as well as your regulatory. So I suppose the point is, it does depend. There are no easy answers. You need to get the right advice, and there certainly can't be from, in 2 minutes in a webinar. The right advice is so critical for your strategy that, engaging with the right experts around your product and taking the time to do that. I'm sorry, Masashi, that was a really long answer.
No, that's okay. Because this is what you offer. When we build the house for the you need a design. This is how we build the house. This is my understanding. Yes, all depends. However, we got, thank you very much for this. We got 10 questions that I cannot cover. But if I can talk about the first one, this is bit specific. The first one is, if a sponsor wants to sell product, this is class 3 implant devices in the UK, for example, UK, France, and Germany. Should we involve all these 3 countries in clinical trial? If not, which country do you have to prioritize? A bit specific, but can you comment?
This is a perfect example of a question that, is so important, why you would need to engage in And here's what I'm going to say to that is, again, it depends. If I were to say which country I think is the best territory, I can't give an answer to that because I don't know ultimately what's the right study because I don't know anything about your product. But all I will say is that each of those 3 countries offer lots of different benefits. And this is where we need to talk about prioritization, because a lot of companies actually really need to be very honest with themselves and about their commercial plans. What market is their biggest market where they think they're going to get regulatory approval the fastest, and then market reimbursement and access the fastest? Because so many clients, that they're not necessarily asking the right questions, Masashi. And I think that that's really important to understand, is that it depends on what your budget is to run studies, because there will be variances. It also depends on how quickly. I mean, yes, the Germans have a great system similar to the UK in terms of, fast regulatory approvals to start the study. But it could be that actually getting the study up and running in those hospitals is not as quick as maybe it would be, say, in France. The French have different support systems in places when it comes to medical devices as well. So there's so many pros and cons to each one of those countries. The simple fact is, if you're going to market a product in the UK, you will need a UKCA mark. The other thing to remember is you also have to consider that, like I said before, the whole issue here is your commercial impetus and what is important to you as a company. I can tell you all kinds of reasons why you might want to select one company over another, but the simple fact is many countries accept high quality data as long as that study is conducted well and in accordance with all of the regulations. So you don't necessarily have to run a study in every country, but it does depend on the product, very much so. And it will also depend on how that product, for whatever reason, that country might require data because of something that's new or different. And that's why I can't give a definitive answer, because there's too many unknowns. And in order to be able to arrive at the right decisions, you have to map them all out and then understand exactly what your priorities are, what your budget is. I don't think we talk enough about budgeting and about money and about cost of running studies. I think it's really important that we have these honest conversations as well. And I think companies need to be aware of what that means. So again, a very long-winded answer, Masashi, but I feel like it's really important because it applies to all of the next questions too. I mean, I can't say what has been changed from MDD to MDR because so many things have changed. The regulations, the regulations are there. You can read through them. They're all available. It's very specific to what class of device that you have. All I can say is the most important thing to remember is MDR was implemented because companies were simply not providing enough data on the safety and efficacy of their products. And now the requirements, if anything, they're just asking companies, the requirements were always there, but now there's a lot more, let's say, safeguarding to make sure that that data is provided. But there's still until 2024. MDR was supposed to be in full swing by now, and it's not, because there's been so many different things that have happened that have made it a really long and difficult transition, like certification of notified bodies, for example. So again, and different types of products, the classifications changed. There's great blogs, there's great resources out there that can do that far more justice than I can, and I can certainly signpost to that. But again, it's a transition process, that's all I can say, and that in order to really understand it, you need to go and read up on it and take the time to do that.
Thanks very much. For the regional perspectives, maybe we have to support like a market analysis. I just typed my email address in the chat box. So if there's like specific questions, just send me email. I can pass over to Nicola later. If I can pick up like a general question, sorry for the people who can. Is there any like a financial support or incentive doing clinical studies for startups companies doing trial in the UK by like government support or
you can apply.
non-UK,
You can apply for grants. That's the only thing you can do is apply for grants. And again, it depends on your investment. If you, for example, if you want to set up, and in Masashi, you'll know a lot more about this than I do, but if you want to set up an entity in the UK, then it potentially makes you eligible to apply for different kinds of UK grants. What I mentioned before, the NIHR, yes, there are supports, not necessarily in terms of giving money, but certainly supports, like I said, in terms of helping find sites, for example. There's different programs that do that. But ultimately, the answer is, you have to fund the commercial development of your product yourself. There are supports out there, but there's not many of them. Again, the French, and I'm not up to date with this, so you need to speak to people that are. But there were some incentives in France around medical device studies, and I can certainly signpost to experts in that area as well. Again, different countries, there's 28 of them in the EU, plus the UK. So, I would also just be very cautious about, and I see there's another question here about the cost. And as this person has put, there's a big range of costs between 10,000 and 80,000 per patient. And it's true. You've got huge ranges of costs per patient to run studies in any country. It all depends on what kind of study you're running and why you want to run it that way. And again, Masashi, that's one of the things that we offer advice and support on is, if anything, how you design that study and why you design it that way will obviously impact how much that study is going to cost you. And I think the point I was trying to make earlier is that, really, really understanding what it is you want to prove in your phase 1, your phase 2A, B, etc., all of that, and why you want to do that. One of the many reasons is actually the cost of running the type of study. You might think you need to run one kind of study, but actually, if you take the time and the effort and involve the right people, you might not have to run that study that way at all. You might be able to run it a different way, and then it won't cost you all of the money that you think it's going to.
Thanks, Dr. Yes, yes.
So I have one question to Nicola. Now we are talking about the clinical trial in UK or EU, but I believe the many Japanese companies are looking for the opportunity to obtain the approval in not only in Japan but also EU and US.
Yes.
So based upon your experience in the past, so do you have any advice for these companies? For instance, the order of the clinical trial in different regions, or when do you suggest to initiate the clinical trials?
So that's a great question. The first part of that question is, in terms of the order of which countries and where to run a study, again, that it really depends on that market. And I think what we have seen in our experience is a lot of our clients want to run studies in the US because that's the market that they want to get approval in first. And I will say that the US as a research location has so many benefits. There are just amazing places to run research there, and the timing. So once your approval process through what we call the IRB is very, very quick, and there's so many great reasons, but it's expensive. Shinichi-san, and I think companies really have to realize that conducting research in the US will be quick from a time perspective. And also just to mention as well that the FDA as a regulatory organization are extremely supportive. There's lots of early stage engagement programs that companies might want to access. Again, I encourage people to use the right experts to help them through that process. But they are wonderful, particularly I heard recently some great examples of support with development of digital and AI products. But I would say really understand where you want to sell your product, really understand the costs involved in running the studies in different countries. And all I can say is that also understand how you can get access to the right types of institutions to run those studies for you, because not all of the top centers are the best places to run your research. There are wonderful organizations. And also to consider, like I said before, when you're designing your study, what can you use as real world evidence? What can you do from a decentralized point of view in terms of gathering data? All of these things. And again, to help people really understand that no matter where you go for your approval, that authority will always recognize extremely well run clinical trial data. Wherever you run it will always be the key factor. Oh, I'm just looking at the time. Masashi, I'm
That's
sorry.
okay, that's okay. I'm a bad timekeeper. But yes, Nicola keeps saying it's quite important to have a good partner to conduct your clinical studies, because there's many aspects, many factors, and you have to suffer with. And what I can say is if you want to gain back to the questions, go to public money grants, it's better to have like a UK company entity, and I personally can have some support, or you can request like a 40 weeks for clinical studies, etc. But the localization timing is quite the key to consider the overall clinical studies as key. Good. 2 minutes over. I'm sorry, Soyama-san. I'm not timekeeper, and I'm sorry for those who cannot answer the question. We got many, so I try to take a memo and answer to you as possible. And for archive, maybe Nicola will share the slide for today, and we can ask you for the link for that you mentioned.
Yes,
you
the
share
report,
with me
sure.
later. Cool. All right, so I will send the microphone to Soyama-san. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your great presentation and discussions, Nicola-san, Masashi-san, and Shunichi-san. That was quite informative and very implicable. Thank you very much. So, as Masashi-san said, I'm sorry that we couldn't answer all the questions in Q&A column in this webinar. So, as Masashi-san kindly said, if you have any question or some further questions, please contact Masashi-san. He kindly shares his information, contact information in the chat column, right? そう、今日は本当にありがとうございました。で、ご視聴の皆様、本当にありがとうございました。最後までね、全部、ご質問に答えられなかったんですが、ぜひ、どしどしと松永さんに、ここに書いたことでなくても、ご質問、いろいろご相談としていただければ、大変幸いでございます。これにて、本イベント終了させていただきますが、ぜひアンケートの方にもお答えをいただければと思います。So, thank you very much. ニコラさん、マサシさん、
ありがとう。
ありがとう。
ありがとう。